place. If one of these elements is not present, a fire won't start. If one is taken away once the fire has started, then the fire will go out. Firstly, fire needs fuel or something flammable. The fuel can be a solid material, a liquid, or a gas. Secondly, there must be sufficient oxygen to keep the fire going. Fire is fed by oxygen. A fire cannot start in an oxygen-free environment. Such a situation is almost non-existent naturally on Earth. Air contains around 21% oxygen. We need around 20% in order to breathe, but fire only requires around 16% oxygen in order to thrive. The third element is something to cause ignition. In some cases, a spark is sufficient. In other cases, adequate heat suffices. When these three elements combine, it starts a chain reaction that leads to a fire. Different types of material require different levels of heat in order to combust. But with sufficient heat and a supply of oxygen, almost everything around you can burn. Fire is subdivided into various categories, depending on the material or the fuel. You must be aware of these fire categories because you can't employ the same method to extinguish every type of fire. If you've ever seen an oil fire, you probably know that water just makes it worse, whilst putting out an electric fire with water is likely to result in electrocution. The most common fire is a Category A fire. Normal flammable materials such as wood, paper and textiles are the fuel for Category A fires. Water is an excellent way of extinguishing a Category A fire. Category B fires are started by combustion of liquids. A petrol fire is a Category B fire. There's a significant risk of explosion with such fires. Category C fires are started by combustion of gases. A propane fire is a Category C fire. There's also a risk of explosion with these fires. If the fuel for a fire is a flammable metal, it's known as a Category D fire. It's unlikely that you'll encounter these fires in everyday life, but they do occur. Metals such as magnesium, titanium, and sodium are potential fuel for Category D fires. Many fires start in kitchens, normally through unsaturated fats overheating and igniting. If your workplace has a large commercial kitchen, it's vital to have a Category F fire extinguisher, a deep fat fryer or fat fire extinguisher. Fires caused by electricity are not regarded as a specific fire category, as electricity itself can't start fires, but it's a common cause of fires. This is often due to short-circuiting or an overloaded wall socket. Electrical fires can generally be put out using a Category A or B fire extinguisher. If a fire breaks out, you need to identify what type of fire it is and know what to do, depending on the fire category. Whether you work in a factory or an office, you work with flammable materials. Remember, all a fire needs is oxygen, fuel, and a way of igniting through heat or a spark. If you work in an office, make sure that there are no large stacks of paper or rubbish lying around. This includes making sure that waste paper bins aren't overflowing. If you smoke, observe the warning notices and only smoke in designated areas. Make sure you put out your cigarette and dispose of it in the appropriate place. A burning cigarette stub, carelessly tossed in a waste bin, has been the cause of a number of serious fires. If you work with equipment that uses flammable materials or needs cleaning with rags that become greasy, store everything that may be flammable in a sealed metal tin, well away from any potential source of ignition. In office blocks, the main cause of...
All right, thank you. So you can project the slides. Right, so well, usually this is supposed to be a very elaborate training, okay? Because there's so much to cover. So I'm going to try to compress this as much as I can, just some form of summary, okay? So I'll skip some things and then I'll emphasize on a number of things. Okay? Emphasize a number of things. Right. So, can you put it on this screen? Very good. Can't seem to. Okay. Is this from me? Okay. Okay, fine. So we're going to start with which way? To the window. Okay. Okay, fine. All right. All right. Now we're going to start with. What does it take to start a fire? Okay, what does it take to start a fire? There's what we call the fire tetrahedron. From the lecture video we saw, you would see that a fire can only start when 3 elements come together in adequate proportions. Okay? Adequate proportions. We have fuel, we have heat, and we have oxygen. So what you have there is called the fire tetrahedron. Okay, and in the center of it, you'll see that there's a chemical chain reaction. Now, you'll agree with me that we have fuel in this church, right now. So when I say fuel, I mean anything that can burn. It exists in solid, liquid, and gaseous states, right? So anything that can burn is considered as fuel. And we also have oxygen. Do we agree? Right? And we also have heat. Here, do you agree? So if oxygen, fuel, and heat are the components that start a fire, why don't we have a fire currently? Can anyone attempt? They are not in adequate proportion. So which of the elements is not at the rate it should be for a fire to start? We have enough fuel. Even human beings are fuel. The chairs are fuel. Yes? Heat. Very good. So, for a fire to start, the heat has to get to ignition temperature. Okay? There's a minimum of 21% of oxygen in the atmosphere. Fire needs only 16% of that oxygen to start. And of course, fuel is everywhere. So the ignition temperature has to get to a point where it's hot enough to spark a fire. That is why we don't have a fire here. The problem, however, is that when we attain ignition temperature, it's now difficult to bring it down. Because there's fuel and there's an abundance of oxygen in the environment. Okay? So heat now becomes the most dangerous, or the most sensitive aspect in this fire triangle. So the idea of this training is to ensure that at the end of the day, in our homes, in our workplaces, and wherever we find ourselves, we try as much as possible to eliminate the possibility of heat. Okay? Because heat is the most unnatural amongst the 3, pertaining getting to ignition temperature. Right? There's heat, but it's harder to get heat than to get oxygen and fuel. Oxygen and fuel are in abundance. Heat is unnaturally introduced. I don't know if I'm making sense. Heat is unnaturally introduced. So our job should be, as much as possible, to ensure that ignition elements are kept as far away from as far as possible from our environment. Especially for those who have children. You know, the kids of our kids are very inquisitive. They see their mothers in the kitchen. They watch TV. So they see lighters, and they keep wondering, what is this lighter for? This thing that my mom uses in the kitchen, that's always, they want to try it. Okay? So we should ensure as much as possible that we keep ignition devices as far away as possible from our kit. Okay, so when these three elements come together in adequate proportion, a fire starts. Right? Now, I'm going to be moving a little fast. So we have, good. Now, based on the types of fuel that we have, fires are classified into 5. We have Class A fires, we have Class B fires, we have Class C fires, we have Class D fires, and we have what we call Class K fires. And a 6th one that we don't put in a class because it can easily move from one class to another. We call it electrical fires. So if you are writing, this is a good time to write. We have 5 classes of fire. Class A, so just write Class A dash, I'm going to explain, Class A dash, Class B dash, and then when I come to each of them, I'll itemize. So Class A, we call it flammable solids. Flammable solids. By flammable solids, we mean chairs, we mean clothes, we mean beddings, even human beings fall under Class A fires because it's a class where solids can burn. Where solids can burn. That's Class A fire. Class B fires, we call it flammable liquids. Flammable liquids. By flammable liquids, we mean petrol, right? We mean gasoline, spirits, grease, and all of that. Flammable liquids. Now, Class C is flammable gases. Now, the reason why I use flammable before the items is because not every solid is flammable. Yes? Not every liquid is flammable. Not every gas is flammable. Okay? So when I say flammable solids, flammable liquids, flammable gases, I'm talking about the states of matter that can burn. Okay? A rock, for example, cannot burn. Right? So a rock will only burn to the extent of external fuel on it. When that external fuel is exhausted, the fire will go out. Okay? But this can burn. So this can keep burning until everything turns to ash. Okay? Now that's why we're taking that way. Now Class D fires are what we call metallic fires. And these are fires that the average person will never experience because they are fires that are seen in industries, large plants, okay, mechanical plants and stuff like that. Those are Class D fires. Then we have Class K fires. Class K. All right? In some literature, they call it Class F. Okay? But I use Class K. And that is kitchen fires. Kitchen fires. Kitchen fires. All right. So, one of the easiest things that we can do, particularly about Class A fires, where most of our problem starts from, especially in the home, is that we can ensure that we have proper housekeeping. Proper housekeeping. What do I mean by that? If you're in the habit of piling up unnecessary stuff in your house, I would advise you have a change of attitude. Some of us buy televisions and we keep the cartons. You buy fridge, you keep the carton. You buy microwave, you keep the carton. Old clothes that you don't use, you pile it. Broken down furniture, you pile it. Now, what you're doing is that you're accumulating fuel in your house. Remember, in the beginning we said that 3 components come together to start a fire. Fuel, oxygen, and heat. If you remove one of these components, the fire will go out. Right? So, if you reduce the fuel load in your house, what you've done is that you've taken a preventive step against fire. We always advise that whatever is not in use should be taken outside the house or totally discarded. Okay? Outside the house or totally discarded, because by doing so, you have now reduced the fuel load in your house. Are we together? Now, in Class B, so that's Class B. So now Class B fires talks about, like I said, petroleum, kerosene, diesel, and all that stuff. In previous years, we've had this issue whenever it comes to December, there's always fuel scarcity, right? So the tendency for the average person is to store petrol at home. A few years ago, we had a rather unfortunate incident in Bukuru where this guy stored kegs of petroleum at home. Okay, he was anticipating there will be scarcity, so he's a black market guy. So he decided to hoard petrol in his house, gallons. And unfortunately, he put the petrol along his exit routes in the house. Okay, that morning, his wife took their child to the grandmother's place for the day. She got back, was preparing breakfast. He was in the house. And somehow a fire started. And they both burnt to ashes, okay? We got there, but we only brought out their... It's not good to see, okay? Now, hoarding petroleum inside your house just exposes your household to significant risk. Okay? And it's worse that it's along your exit plan. No, whenever we teach about fire, we always say that your exit routes out of the house must always remain clear. So if you live in a house where there's only one door in and out, you are living in a very risky environment. There's no reason why you should take a house, whether rented or not, that has only one entry and exit point into the house. There's a reason why back doors are put in building. There's a reason why they are put in building. So that if the front is trapped, you have an alternative route outside the house. But now you find out that some people, is that back door, they will put jerry can, they will put broken down TV, they will assume that after all, nobody uses it often. It's important that our exit routes are always kept clear in case of an emergency. These things don't tell anybody when they're coming. They don't tell anybody. So we need to be prepared to avoid these things. Now we're going to Class C, where we'll talk about flammable gases. Now, for those of you who are in the habit of leaving your gas cylinders inside the house, you're also taking a risk. I have a feeling that 90% of people listening to me have their cooking cylinders inside their house. Right? It's a risk. Why is it a risk? Because the tubing from your gas cylinder to your gas cooker might wear out at any time. A number of people don't think it is wise to change their tube. Now, the fabric of the tube is breakable. Okay? So over time, it starts to break. A number of people have never changed that hose since they bought their cylinders. Right? So what happens is that there might come a time where wear and tear has affected that hose. Okay? And it keeps supplying gas, and then one morning, there's a break, and gas is escaping. So you can just wake up one morning to cook, and immediately you strike matches, right? The house will engulf in fire. Because there's already gas in the atmosphere, waiting for what? Ignition. All right? So it's advisable that every year or every 2 years, okay, change the hose from your gas cylinder to your gas cooker, and change the head if possible. I had a very unfortunate incident a few days ago. After a busy day, got back home around 6, 7 p.m. Most gas shops had closed, and I usually keep an extra regulator in my house. But it was late and we couldn't find it. My wife couldn't cook. I had to leave the house around 8 p.m. looking for a regulator because I had to eat that night. Okay, so I kept telling myself, instead of keeping one now, maybe I should start keeping two. So that if I don't find one, I'll find the other one. There might be emergency situations like that where you need to change the regulator or the hose immediately. Okay, so if you discover that that is happening, just change it. And especially if you have children at home, okay, you shouldn't expose your children to those kind of situations. You might not be at home when a fire starts, but why don't you prevent it by just doing the right thing to do? Okay, now, if you have a vehicle, you service your car maybe every 3 months or every 6 months. You don't wait for the vehicle to have a problem before you service it, right? Because you are avoiding the problem, you will service the vehicle. So that's what we also do. We advise people. Before the problem arises, change the hose, change the regulator, and if you're in a safe environment, please take your gas cylinder outside. I know there's always the fear of theft, okay, and it's understandable. Okay. What you can do is, if you're at home, you can make it a habit of bringing it in at the end of the day. When you want to use it, take it outside. But using it indoors is really not advisable. All right? Next slide, please. It's not advisable. Now, I won't spend time on this because this usually happens in factories, and the average person is not exposed to flammable metals, okay, because it's high intensity. All right? Now, Class K fires, kitchen fires, I want to dwell a bit on this. I've actually started talking about it. You know, when we were younger, we used to watch these soap operas. The Rich Also Cry, Maria de Los Angeles, and later on they started bringing Papa Jasco and all those things. You find out that the average person cooking gets distracted in the evenings watching television, right? So we always advise you never leave cooking unattended. Kitchen fires are among the main causes of fires at home. My friend had an unfortunate incident when she nearly burnt her child alive because of this. Okay, so we advise that you never leave cooking unattended to, and there are things that you should have in your home that will help safeguard against fire incidents. Okay, like I was telling our daddy earlier on about the importance of having smoke detectors at home. Now, in the kitchen, you don't have a smoke detector in the kitchen because there could always be smoke, so it'll trigger a false alarm. But if you can afford it, you can install what we call a heat detector in your kitchen, right? A heat detector in your kitchen. What that does is that there's a certain temperature above which it will trigger an alarm. Of course, the kitchen is usually hot when you cook, right? But it's manageable. It's manageable. However, if the detector picks up a temperature above carrying capacity that can cause a fire, it will trigger an alarm. So it's also important to have these smoke detectors in every part of the house. So heat detector for kitchen, smoke detector for other parts of the house. In your living room, in your bedroom, in your corridor, okay? If you have a gym at home, in your gym. If you have an office at home, in your office at home, just install a smoke detector. Because when a fire starts, smoke is one of the byproducts of fire. Okay, so it will alarm you early enough. Now, if you get an early alarm, you can now depending on the size of the fire, you can extinguish the fire or call for help. What we usually advise is immediately you discover a fire, raise an alarm. Even if you feel you can extinguish it, raise the alarm, okay? Let help be coming. If you extinguish it, then you can tell them, all right, you guys can go back. I don't need you anymore. Because if you start trying to fight a fire without calling for help, it can escalate. And it will be too late to call for help that will come on time. You get the problem. One of the problems we have as a service is that, people usually say the fire service is not effective. Okay? But if I ask right now, how many of us have the emergency number of the fire service? No, the emergency number of any fire service. Right? Okay, so can we just see hands? 1 out of 2, 3 out of 4 out of 25 people. Right? So that's not good. 4 out of 25 is very poor. It's a fear. Okay? Now, this is what happens. Mr. A discovers a fire, and he does not have the number of emergency service. So he now calls Mr. B. Do you help us call fire? Mr. B said, Nimaban the number. Mr. B will now call me. So there's a time gap now. So maybe Mr. D will eventually call the fire service. When they arrive, the people will say, they called you since, and you are just coming. Okay, the fire service, they're not magicians. Okay, we cannot know where a fire is at every point in time. We are hoping and praying we get to a point in Nigeria where maybe our houses will be connected to a central system, so that if there's a fire, it will beep on the board. Okay, but it might take us some time. Okay, but for now, let's all have the emergency number of the fire service. You should have emergency number of the fire service, of the police in your area, okay, of a hospital facility in your area. Right? This is very important. Why do you need to have the emergency number of a hospital? Now, I'm digressing a bit. I'm just trying to cover a number of things. It's because you might have a midnight emergency, okay, and you'll need to inform the hospital on time. We have this case. We are rushing this person to the hospital. You've now prepared them ahead to make arrangements for your coming. You understand? Okay, someone might be in labor midnight, okay, and they need attention. So even if a doctor is not on ground, your call has alerted them to call the doctor. So before you get to the hospital, the doctor should be on his way as well. Instead of getting to the hospital and then they'll start calling the doctor. You're now one step ahead. Okay? Sometimes people have this issue of security where they are boggled and they don't know. You know, people even have these vigilante areas. And you don't even have their numbers. Okay? Until after the deed is done and they've stolen and they've gone, then we'll come out and start shouting, thief, thief, thief. At that point, the damage has been done. So it's important to have these 3 critical emergency numbers: the fire service, the security service, and a health facility close to you. Okay? It's very important so that you can get help on time. And the thing about fire is that fire doesn't wait. Once it starts burning, it keeps burning as long as there's fuel. Okay? It keeps burning as long as there's fuel. So let's do our bit to reduce that possibility. Now, what are the main causes of fire? We have 3 main causes of fire. Okay? Natural causes, carelessness, and willful causes, which is arson. Amongst these 3, carelessness ranks for 90% of the fires we respond to. Recently, we had a grid collapse where there was no power supply in the country, for most parts of the country. I heard Lagos had power supply, consistent power supply, regardless of what's happening in the rest of Nigeria. Okay, so they probably annexed themselves or what, I don't know. So, we found out that people, even before then, you'll see an electric socket, 1 extension, and there may be 10 phones on it. Right? Because everybody wanted to charge their phones. Now, what that does is that it increases the heat of the extension cord box. So if you turn your back, a fire can start at any moment. Matter of fact, if we had gone through the rest of that video, you'll see that we don't even advise that on the same socket, on the same wall sockets, you put like 2 wall sockets together. We don't even advise that you plug something in 2 wall sockets together at the same time. And it's unfortunate now that a number of the materials sold in the market are substandard. So maybe a 2 mm wire, a wire of 2 mm that should be put in a place. Maybe they'll put 1 mm. And the heat coming from the power stations is more than the wiring can carry. So before you know it, it'll burn that socket. That is why from time to time you'll see what we call scorch marks on the wall. Okay, so when you see a scorch mark on the wall, it's one of two things. It's either the carrying capacity of the wire has failed, okay, or the power supply from the station is more than it can carry. And that's an indication that you need to pay attention to. So it's either you replace it, okay, or you put a stabilizer on the wall to safeguard your house, okay. And one of the first things to do when you discover an electrical fire is not to try to fight the fire. Which brings me to the last class of fire, electrical fires. Electrical fires. Now, electrical fire is not in any class because it can easily move from electrical to class A or to class B or to class C, right? So in an instance where a fire, an electric fire starts, and there's a pile of solid fuel by the side, it's now no longer an electrical fire, it's now a class A fire. So you attend to that fire as a class A fire. But the first thing to do when you discover an electrical fire is to switch off the power source. Okay? We all have these transformer, changeover boards in our homes. So immediately discover a fire, electrical fire, don't try to fight it. Go to your switchboard and just switch off. Now, whatever is burning gives you now a direction that, okay, this is wood that is burning. I can now either use water or powder or CO2 to extinguish that fire. Please, let us never use water in kitchen fires. I don't want to assume that everybody knows, so let me emphasize it. Please, if you discover a fire in the kitchen, never use water to try to extinguish it. The reason being that water, especially if it's an oil fire, water has a higher density than oil, right? So, oil can float on water. That's why if you go to the high sea, sometimes you see, right? You see fire burning on, and somebody will say, water. How is fire burning on water? It's because the density of oil is lower than water. So if you put them together, the lighter one comes up, which is oil. So it will float on the surface of the water until it burns out. So you can see for hours, you see fire on water. It's not the water gongo, it's the oil on it. Once it exhausts the oil on the fire, the oil on the water, the fire goes out. Okay. So if you try to fight a kitchen fire, especially an oil fire, with water, when you pour the water will go down and push the fire up. That's why sometimes it seems like explosions. Okay. And the bad thing is that the pressure you use in turning the water into the oil will now make the oil now splash out and keep burning. So if the oil splashes out on bread or on a dry table, you've now transferred the fire to something else. Okay? So we always advise it's important to have what we call a fire blanket in your kitchen. Okay? A fire blanket in your kitchen. You should also have when we get to types of extinguishers, I'm going to emphasize on that. Okay? Because you don't use the same type of extinguisher for different types of fires. There are different types of fires that have different types of extinguishers for us to use. So I'm going to emphasize on that. Right. Now, some hazards to look for in your workplace and homes. Number one, locked or blocked exits, which is a very common hazard. it's important that every member of your household knows, well, because of security, for security reasons, okay, we all lock our doors at night, we all do that. But every member of your household should know where your spare keys are, your children and the visitors that come to your house, so that if anything happens, the occupants of the house are not trapped. Okay? For security reasons, sometimes we'll lock our doors, move the key, and hide somewhere, which is good. Okay? But for every occupant of the house, they should know where you keep those things, right? So that in the need of emergency, they can. Now, we found out that most times people die from fire incidents not because of the fire itself, but smoke inhalation. Okay? So, last 2 years in Lagos, we had an unfortunate incident. This house, there was no light. They put on the generator, and they took the generator inside the house, okay, and locked the doors and slept off, right? So when we were called in the morning, we just came and evacuated corpses, because in their sleep, they just kept inhaling the gas, and they just transited from there. The entire family, they just transited from there, you know. So number 2, trash or debris, electrical hazards, cooking hazards, all of that, you should ensure that you take them out of the house. Number 3, smoking areas. Now, you find out that some people smoke in bed. Some people just lie down in bed and smoke. Maybe watching a movie or reading a book, and then they can slip off. Now, when you slip off, the stub still has fire. It drops off from the hand onto the bed, and bed is what? Fuel. Right? So the person will just probably wake up on the other side of eternity. Okay? Exit signs and block. Now, one of the things I do when I come to a facility like this is to look at the number of exits we have in church. Okay? And apart from these, do we have exits on this side? Yes. Okay? Not the restroom. Okay. Now, it's important because if a fire starts in one side, it buys you some time to use the other side to go out. It's usually difficult that a fire will start at a point and then spread that fast. Okay. So we encourage exits at opposite sides, so that if one place is trapped, people can use the alternative. Okay? Now, emergency lighting hazards. We also have fire extinguisher hazards. Okay, if you use the wrong fire extinguisher for a type of fire, you might, like example, while the powder extinguisher is effective for outdoors, it may not be effective. In fact, it's not effective indoors. Okay? If a house is trapped, for example, and there's a fire, and you try to use the DCP, it might put out the fire, but if there's no ventilation in that room, it might lead to people getting unconscious, because it's chemical powder, and if there's no way to ventilate the room when you put out the fire, it means that the occupants in that room at that point will inhale it. Now that becomes a hazard for them, which is why we always advise using dry chemical powder extinguisher outdoors, because we have more oxygen outside, and then the wind will carry the powder debris. Okay, but we encourage a certain type of extinguisher indoors, which is the CO2 extinguisher. I'm going to come to that. But for now, I'm going to talk with the leadership of the church. We're going to organize a fire evacuation one day. Okay, we'll do a fire drill for the church. We'll just come one day and simulate it, and we'll gauge your response, and then see how to improve. Okay, because whenever there's an emergency, there's usually also a stampede. Okay, so the idea of a fire evacuation drill is to help people safely exit a building when there's an emergency without threat to their lives. Okay? Without threat to their lives. And also, we're going to do a risk assessment for the church, because I just hope that your leadership will allow us to do this. We're going to probably change the way the door swings. Because when there's an emergency, the pressure is to push outwards. Okay? If our doors swing inwards, if the first person who gets to the door is under a lot of pressure, people keep piling. So you now can't open the door. But if the door swings outwards, it's easier to push the door out. Are we getting it? So that's why it's important for us to do a risk assessment to correct these things if they're not right. Now, fire extinguishers. We have, for want of boring you, I'm going to focus on 3 types of fire extinguishers. The most common is water, but water has been phased out. Okay? So we no longer use water fire extinguishers. Okay? We no longer use water type fire extinguishers. What we use now is dry chemical powder and CO2, carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, carbon dioxide fire extinguisher works on the mechanism of smothering the fire. Smothering. Okay? By smothering, a layman's word is beating down the fire. Okay? Beating down the fire. By doing that, you're trying to remove oxygen. You remember I told you that before a fire starts, 3 components must come together: heat, oxygen, and fuel. Okay? Now, what the dry chemical powder does is that it smothers the fuel. In this case, solid fuel. Okay? So, the dry chemical powder extinguisher is effective for fighting Class A fires. Is most effective for fighting Class A fires. It can also be used for fighting Class B fires. It can also be used for fighting Class C fires, depending on the level of expertise of the person using it. Okay? But for this training, I would like you to zero your minds on the fact that dry chemical powder is effective for fighting Class A fires. Let's leave it that way. Dry chemical powder is effective for fighting Class A fires. Now, Class B fires, which is flammable liquids, the most effective way of fighting this is not even with the CO2. You only use CO2 or DCP. Use that when this option is not available. We use a foam solution for fighting Class B fires. That is why whenever we go for, sometimes we are called for fires in filling stations, all right, or a tanker falls and a fire starts. We don't use water, we don't use powder. We use a foam solution. And why do we use a foam solution? Because when we pour the solution on the surface of the oil, it excludes the oil from oxygen. So the foam, the lather, okay, coats the surface of the oil and excludes oxygen. So when there's no oxygen to support combustion, what happens? The fire goes out. We don't use water to fight Class B fires. We use a foam solution. We use a foam solution. Okay? Now, Class C fires, which is flammable gases, we can use the dry chemical powder or the CO2 if it's in a confined space. Okay? If it's in a confined space, we can use the CO2 or the dry chemical powder. Now, when you come to kitchen fires, you can either use the CO2, okay, or what I mentioned earlier, the fire blankets. In the absence of a fire blanket, you can use a wet towel. A wet towel. You can use a wet towel in the absence of a fire blanket. A fire blanket is a special material. When we go for practicals, I'm going to show you. It's a special material used to extinguish fire because it has a fire resistance to a certain level, okay, that you can use to smother out the fire without burning the material. If you carry wrapper and use, it will burn the wrapper. Okay? Because the wrapper material does not have the coating of a fire blanket. Okay? Now, the reason why I said a wet towel is because being wet, okay, it's easier for it not to burn than for a regular material to burn. Are we together? So that's what we're going to do. Now, very important points I want you to see. Can we put it up on the screen for everyone to read? Now, never fight fire if the fire is spreading beyond the immediate area in which it started. No, the idea of us teaching you about this for fire safety is because we don't want you to try to be heroes. If a fire starts that is beyond a bucket size, please don't attempt fighting it. You can only attempt to fight a fire when it is small at the incipient stage. Okay? That is at the beginning stage. When a fire is immediately discovered, you can fight it. But once it has started spreading and growing, we don't advise you fight it. Just raise the alarm and leave the premises. Like I said, a fire can easily escalate within seconds. Okay? So don't try to fight a fire when it is already growing. Now, these are different stages of fire. The incipient stage is the initial stage. All right? Then the growth stage starts when more fuel is being consumed. Now, an intensity is building. If you're not a trained firefighter, if you try to fight a fire even at the growth stage, you might get trapped in the building. And of course, I don't expect anyone who is not a trained firefighter to be at the free burning stage and at the fully developed stage. Okay? And very importantly, even if it is at the incipient stage, if you're trying to fight a fire, make sure that you are backing the exit of wherever you are. Okay? So, if you discover a fire, and the fire is between you and your exit, don't try to fight the fire. Okay? Just escape. Just leave the premises. Because you might not be able to extinguish the fire and your exit is blocked. So you can't get out of the fire. Okay? So make sure that your exit is behind you. If you're trying to fight the fire and it goes beyond your capacity, you can just turn and leave the place. Okay? Now, don't try to fight a fire if you are unsure of the proper operation of the extinguisher. We had an incident in the University of Jos a few years ago when they had a fire incident, and the untrained security men, I don't blame them, they didn't know better at the time. When there was a fire incident, they just kept throwing the extinguishers into the fire. Like literally throwing it into the fire, you know. Now, we have a type of extinguisher that we can do that with, and it's called a fireball. Okay? There's what we call a fireball that we can throw into a fire. It will explode and extinguish the fire. But you can't throw a cylinder into a fire and expect it to explode. If it explodes, it will cause more damage. Right? So we can throw a fireball, and the fireball, the content is powder. So when it explodes, the powder residues will put out the fire. Okay? Number 4, don't try to fight a fire if you doubt that the extinguisher you are holding is designed for the type of fire at hand or is large enough to fight the fire. I've already touched on these extinguishers. There's really so much to cover. Okay, so I'm going to teach you how to operate a fire extinguisher. Okay. So like I said, we're going to focus on two types of extinguishers, the DCP and the CO2. The good thing about the DCP, the CO2, which is the gas, is that it will help you to extinguish a small fire without damaging what is burning. Okay? So, for example, you discover an electrical fire, maybe a TV or a laptop, okay, that's connected, right? So, once you put off the power source and the laptop or the TV is still burning, you can use a CO2 to extinguish that fire, and it will not cause more damage to your television because the CO2 operates on a mechanism of cold compressed gas. Okay? So it just cools off the fire and evaporates. It cools and evaporates. Cools and evaporates. When we go outside, I'm going to show you how it works. Okay? But if you use a dry chemical powder on your television, it will still put off the fire. Okay? But you can tell it will cause what? More damage to that equipment. Because the powder residues will now be stuck where? In the gadget, in the television. You understand? So it now takes a lot of time to work it out. So we advise the use of CO2 indoors and DCP outdoors. And that is why the fire extinguisher in your car is not CO2, but DCP. Okay? Another reason is because the density of powder is more than the density of air. Okay? So if I try to use a CO2 for a car fire, while I'm jetting towards the fire, some of it is escaping because it's gas. Okay? But if I'm using powder because of the density, if I jet it towards what is burning, it will hit it because the density is higher and there's enough pressure to push it. Right? But indoors, I can use the CO2 because it's controlled environment. So I'm not afraid of it getting lost while I try to jet towards its burning. Okay? Now, there's an acronym that we use for operating the fire extinguisher. It's called PASS, P-A-S-S. So after this, we're just going to round up. PASS. Okay? You can just write it so you don't forget. It's usually on the data plate of any fire extinguisher you buy. But these days, I found out that for sharp practices, some of the vendors buy refurbished ones, okay, and sell as new without that data plate. And that data information is very important because it helps the layman know how to operate the extinguisher and what type of extinguisher it should be used for a type of fire, right? So the PASS stands for P, pull pin. Pull pin. A, aim at the base of fire. Now, if there's a fire burning somewhere, you don't just spread the content of the extinguisher haphazardly. Okay, every fire has what we call a seat, where it started from, or a root. Okay, it's like trying to kill a tree. You can't kill a tree from the branches. If you want to kill a tree, you go to the roots, right? So that's what we do. If you're trying to fight a fire that started a small fire, you aim at the seat of the fire. So once that goes out, every other thing stops burning. Okay, so I'm going to teach you how to do that. And then the first S stands for squeeze. Every fire extinguisher has a handle. Okay, so you squeeze it, and the last S stands for sweep side to side. And that is to cut off oxygen supply. Okay, remember I said if one out of the three elements is removed, the fire goes out. Okay? So remember, your safety comes first. When in doubt, leave the firefighting to the professionals. Your safety comes first. When in doubt, leave the firefighting to the professionals. Now, please take down these numbers before I forget. We have a national emergency number in Nigeria, and it's 112. That's our national emergency. So you can call that number when there's a security threat, okay? When there's a flooding threat, when there's a fire disaster. And the agency responsible for receiving those calls will now route your call to the appropriate agency that should respond, okay? So if there's a shootout in my area and I don't have the police number and I call 112, 112 will now call the nearest police station, okay, to turn out people, right? If there's a fire disaster, 112 will call the fire service. But now you see that some time is lost. So what if you can call the agencies direct? You now get a faster response. So for the Federal Fire Service, our emergency number is 070 61 77 77 47. That's Federal Fire Service. Then I'll also give you for the State Fire Service, Plateau State Fire Service. All right, 080 68 12 98 54. 080 68 12 98 54. Now, this is Plateau State Fire Service. Okay, so if you call any of these numbers, there should be some response. Okay, now, let me just say this here before I leave. One of the other reasons why sometimes it seems as if the fire service is not effective, sometimes it boils down to policy direction from our governments. Okay? The truth is that the average fire station is not as funded as it should be, just like many other agencies. So, and firefighting is a very expensive procedure, because if the fire service turns out to a fire, the fire truck has to keep running until the fire is extinguished. Okay? Now, sometimes we turn out to a fire and we exhaust 100 liters of diesel for one fire. Okay? And then you're supposed to turn out to 4 fires maybe in a week. There's now a burden of cost. And if funding is not as it should be, you now know that there's going to be a problem. The fire services cannot respond like they should. Okay? But I'm glad that there's some improvement now. Okay? It's not where it should be, but there's some improvement. Okay? And there's a lot more to be done. That's the truth. Okay, so those are the constraints that sometimes the fire service has. Number 2, sometimes when there's an emergency and the fire service is on the move, vehicles don't yield right of way. Okay, it's actually a punishable offense to not yield right of way to an emergency vehicle, because it makes no sense for a fire truck to be stuck in traffic. Okay? Sometimes we respond to fires and people who should give right of way are trying to drag the same route with emergency. It doesn't work anywhere in the world. We had an incident in Abuja a few years ago where our men turned out to a fire call on an estate. While rushing, this vehicle in front refused to yield right of way. They brushed him and passed. Okay? Only for us to get to the scene of fire to find out that it was that person's house. So karma didn't even wait. All right? Karma didn't even wait. Okay? So please, whenever you're driving or you're in a vehicle with someone driving and you hear the sirens of whether it's the police or the medicals, or because it might be an ambulance, your cousin might be the one in the ambulance. I don't wish evil for anybody, but it's reality. It happens. It might be a loved one, it might be a friend. Okay, so don't be a clog in the wheel of someone's safety. Please and please encourage other road users to yield right of way to emergency vehicles and emergency service providers. And I trust that good Lord helping us will not have to mourn over anyone for any of the disasters. Last but not the least, when your priest tells you, when the pastor tells you that God will protect you, what do you say? Amen. Do you lock your doors at night when you sleep? You still lock your doors, Abby? Does it mean that the pastor's prayer is not effective? It's effective, right? So when I tell you to install fire safety equipment in your house, most of you will say, God forbid. Because you don't want a fire, right? I don't want a fire for you either. But it's important that you take the necessary precaution to avoid it, and then to have equipment in your house that can help you extinguish small fires. Okay? Small fires. Small fires. I keep emphasizing on small fires. Okay? Small fires. All right. So we'll call it a wrap. We'll go outside for... I've taken more time than I was given. I'm sorry, but there's just so much to cover. Just so much to cover. So we'll do a practical outside. And if you have questions, when we come back, I'll respond to your questions and give clarity for areas where there isn't clarity. Thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out to participate in this training today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to believe we have been educated. Even me, myself, there are a lot of things that I do take for granted. And with this, I think more caution will be taken. And you can see the correlation between what we did yesterday, for some of you who were not around. When the road safety was here, he was talking about right of ways. And he talked about science. And you can see today, it's been mentioned. So, all these things that we are doing, you understand, it's not just a kind of, just come and talk. No, it's for our own safety. Security is not all about. You heard him talking about closing our doors. You can see where security now is now coming in. May the Lord help us. So, we'll take some time now to go out and then do some drilling, and then, you understand, for those of you who are following us, we're sorry, we're going to plead with the media if they can snap and then post it for you to see. But how we wish you are here to join us. But we believe you are all being rich with the lesson that our brother has given us. So we'll take some time now and go out, and then have that. Thank you.